Thank you. The people had their fill, and they all chanted together, "Jesus for president! Jesus for president!" They had had their fill of bread and fish. They had never had such an experience ever. I mean, what Jesus was able to do, it exceeded the power of even the emperor. The emperor. I mean, the emperor did pretty well. You know, every once in a while when the population got a little restless, got a little unhappy with the politics and their hunger, the emperor would give them bread. It was called the dole, and it would come from his silos, this grain, and he would hand them out to the people, the citizens of Rome, to keep them quiet, to keep them from complaining. And the people were willing to take it. They'll push down their anger with a little bread, sure. And if you want to put on top of that some entertainment, like gladiators at the Circus Maximus, sure, that would keep them distracted. It's called a campaign of bread and circuses. It was a tactic of the empire, a tactic of the emperor to keep the people from revolting. And today, wow, there's this guy named Jesus, and he's outdoing the emperor with his spectacle. Not just bread. So much, they were so full, there was leftover. And I mean, quite a spectacle. The people knew where they got, the emperor's dole. It was from their taxes. They had given it to the emperor, and they're getting it back. But this Jesus, he multiplied bread and fish. I mean, the emperor couldn't do that. This was a powerful man. Jesus for president! Jesus for president! He will guarantee that we will always have bread. We'll never go hungry again. And not only that, look at how powerful he is. He can do magic. Multiply bread and fish. They want that. They're doing the math. They're like, we'll go with Jesus. He seems really powerful. So strap in. We're taking a detour from Mark for 5 weeks into the Gospel of John. 5 weeks in one chapter, 6, all on bread. Okay, I really need your compassion right now. 5 weeks in the same chapter, and every week, I guarantee you'll be like, didn't we read this last week? Because you did. A lot of it is repeated over the next, 4 weeks after this. It will be very monotonous, and it's very challenging for a preacher to think of something new to say on the same thing about bread. So I just want to give a shout out to Barbara and Lou, who will be sharing this task with me. And we met together to make sure we weren't going to all say the same thing. So 5 weeks of bread. And Jesus takes this 5 weeks because the crowd that ate the bread, they're having a hard time understanding what Jesus is about. The emperor, they understood what he wanted. He wanted them to be quiet eat the bread and do what they're supposed to do and not create trouble for the empire. But they don't know what Jesus wants. Because what Jesus wants is 180 degrees from what the emperor wants, Jesus needs 5 weeks to tell them what it all means. And I'm going to give you a spoiler. They don't get it anyway after 5 weeks. But that's the thing, is the gospel is not written for the crowd. It's written for us. I mean, the last words of the Gospel of John is, this is written for you so that you might come to believe. And so we are the ones who are reading this from an outside perspective, trying to figure out what is the issue here, what is the blind spot, and where does it sit inside of me? So we are getting to witness how the crowd struggles and how Jesus responds, to begin to understand what is the meaning of this multiplication of loaves and fish. What does Jesus want? And today, I want to lift up the first clue. The first clue as to what does Jesus want. And it's a clue because the story of the multiplication of loaves and fish happened in all 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. And that's very rare. Almost nothing happens in all 4, you know. But it's a little different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when Jesus multiplies the loaves and fish, he delegates the task of feeding the crowd to the disciples. But in John, Jesus feeds each of the 5,000 himself. Must have taken a while. Yeah. But Jesus hands the bread to each person. Imagine what it's like in the Gospel of John. This is so important, right? In the Gospel of John, how does Jesus find his sheep? He calls them each by name. And so this is what's happening in the multiplication of loaves and fish. Jesus takes his time, goes to each person, calls them each by name, and gives them the sustenance that they consider is basic to living. Why would he do this? Each person. This is a sign of the meaning of loaves and fishes. Why this is happening. Jesus comes to offer an intimate relationship with each person. And this is what's going on. And the crowd misses it because they are enslaved in their minds to what the empire does when it hands out bread. It's a transaction. It's a transaction. I be quiet, I'll eat your bread. That's what's going on here. But Jesus is handing out bread and giving himself. And they're having a really hard time understanding this. It's way beyond their imagination. And the reason why we are hearing about an enslaved mind, and later on, as we move on into the other weeks, you'll hear about this, talk about manna, etc. So let's begin by a little review of history. The Israelites, when they were freed from Egypt, they left Egypt. As soon as they hit the wilderness and things got hard, and they were free, but they were hungry and thirsty, and immediately they wanted to go back to Egypt. That's all they could imagine as a way to solve their problem, was to go back to enslavement, rather than to persist in freedom and figure things out in the wilderness. And so what's going on here with them not understanding Jesus is that their minds are sold, their spirits are sold to the dole. And they can't imagine that there's something else going on. They can only see themselves as, I'm a person who needs bread. I'm a bread-needing person. And I'm willing to do anything to eat that bread. And Jesus, when he gives the bread, he's giving himself. And he's saying to the people, I am more than bread. You need me. In fact, without your need for God, you are not human. This is a huge thing going on here. So the people see themselves as merely mechanistic. I need bread, I'm a bread-needing person. And Jesus says to them, no, you're a God-needing person. In order to be fully human, you need God. And you are reducing your humanity by saying you only need bread. That's all that you are. And so this is why later on we'll hear the Exodus story and why it's so critical what Jesus is doing. He's trying to transform their minds, to free their minds from the way they view themselves and the way they view God. Because if they're transactional with themselves, they're transactional with God. And what Jesus is offering them is an intimate relationship, a live relationship with them. And who is feeding them? Who is feeding them? What is Jesus claiming? What do we get to know because we get to read? Is that this is why the sign of walking on water follows this. It might seem kind of out of place, like why is it here? And it's because when he is walking on the water and the disciples are afraid, he says to them, and I wish the NRSV would just translate it the way it's supposed to be translated. In Greek, it's not, it is I, it is I am. I am, do not be afraid. And why is that so important? Going back to the Exodus story, Moses, before he goes to the Pharaoh and says, let my people go, he sees a burning bush, and in the burning bush, the bush doesn't say, God says in the bush, I am. That's God's name, right? I am. And so what is happening here when Jesus is walking on water and proclaims, I am, we are supposed to stitch together that I am is the one who fed the people. And I am is the God of freedom and liberation, not just a God that exists, but the God that freed them. So I am is the one who fed the people. And the mind-blowing thing is I am is now in Jesus Christ, who comes in flesh and blood and feeds each person, calls each person by name. This is the God who loves. This is the God, so intimate, so close. And it will take 5 weeks for Jesus to continue to explain this, and the crowd will continue to resist because the crowd is stuck in a transactional view of God. How many of you think about God as the God of intimate love and relationship, or the God who gives you something because you do all the right things, or you go to church, or you pray, right? I mean, I found myself, like, when things get hard, sometimes I'll start bargaining with God, like, I'll be nice to everyone from now on. That doesn't last long. So it's so there's that kind of that's an immature version of God, is to have this thinking like God and I need to bargain with each other in order to survive my life. And here, God is being offered just the relationship of intimate love as the basic sustenance, like bread. Like bread. So here we are, strap in for the next 4 weeks. We're going to consider what it means to be in this intimate relationship with God. What does it require? What transformation happens in our mind? And what is the invitation continually for us to gain that sustenance that is like bread, but more than bread? Amen.